The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was deadheading the roses in my backyard. My son-in-law's number. I almost didn't answer. We hadn't spoken, really spoken, in almost 3 years. Sylvie. His voice was flat. It's about your daughter. She wanted me to tell you that her father passed away last night. The funeral is Saturday. He hung up before I could say anything. I stood there in the garden for a long time, holding my pruning shears, not really seeing the roses anymore. My ex-husband was gone. 41 years of marriage, then 11 years of what came after, and now he was simply gone the way a lamp goes out when you flip the switch. I didn't cry. I want to be honest about that. I had used up most of my tears for him a long time ago. His name was Walter. And what I am about to tell you, I have never told anyone in full. Not my sister, not my doctor, not even the priest I used to confess to back when I still believed confession could fix things. I am 67 years old, and I have kept this quiet for over a decade, and I am tired of being quiet. Walter and I met when I was 23, at a hardware store in Sudbury, of all places. He was buying paint rollers. I was buying a replacement hinge for my kitchen cabinet. He held the door open for me on the way out and asked if I wanted to get coffee. I said yes. That was 1980. We built a life together. A real one, not the Instagram version people perform now, but the unglamorous, day-to-day kind. A house on Larch Street. 2 cars that always needed something. A daughter born in 1985, whom we named Viveka, which was Walter's mother's name, and which I always thought was too old-fashioned but agreed to because I loved him, and that's what you do. Viveka was the best thing we ever made together, and also eventually the most painful. Walter was a contractor, good at his work, genuinely good, the kind of tradesperson people recommend to their neighbors and call back year after year. He built up a company slowly over 20 years, took on partners, expanded into commercial projects. By the mid-90s he was doing well. By 2005 he was doing very well. I won't give you a number because I didn't know the number then. That was part of the problem. I managed the house. I raised Viveka. I kept the books for Walter's company for the first 12 years, until he brought on a proper accountant and gently suggested I might enjoy focusing on other things. I didn't argue. I trusted him the way you trust the ground under your feet, not because you've tested it, but because it has never given way. That changed in the winter of 2011. Our accountant, a man I'll call Mr. T, I won't use his real name because his family still lives in the area, came to me quietly at a Christmas party. He'd had 2 glasses of wine, which I think is the only reason he said anything at all. He pulled me aside near the coat rack and told me in a low voice that there were some irregularities I might want to be aware of. That money had been moved in ways that weren't entirely above board, that if anyone looked too closely, it could be a problem. I asked him what kind of problem. He said, the kind that ends careers, or worse. I went home that night and I sat at the kitchen table until 3 in the morning. Walter was away on a job site in Timmins. I had the whole silent house to think in. What I found out over the following weeks, slowly, carefully, asking questions I framed as casual curiosity, was this: Walter had been moving money through the business for several years. Nothing catastrophically criminal, but enough. Tax sheltering that crossed a line. Payments made to shell companies. The kind of thing that, in the wrong climate with the wrong auditor, could result in charges. Fraud charges. The words sat in my chest like a stone. Walter didn't know that I knew. I spent 3 months deciding what to do. I want you to understand something about that time. I was not a weak woman. I had opinions. I had a university degree I'd never used. I had managed a household and a child and a husband's administrative life for 30 years, and I had done it competently and without complaint. But I was also 60 years old. I had no income of my own, and the idea of Walter going to prison, the shame of it, the unraveling of everything, felt like more than I could hold. What I decided was this: I would protect him. Not because I thought what he had done was right. Not because I didn't feel the slow burn of fury at having been kept in the dark, but because Viveka was 26 years old and just starting her life, and I could not bear for her father to become someone she visited through a glass window. So I did something I have never told another person. I went to Walter's lawyer, not our family lawyer, but the one who handled the business, and I told him that I was the one who had authorized the transactions. That Walter had been acting on my instructions, that the accounts were managed at my direction. I had enough knowledge of the books from my 12 years keeping them to make it plausible. The lawyer looked at me for a very long time. Then he said, "Sylvie, you understand what you're saying?" I said I did. There was a CRA investigation. There were interviews. There were months of the most sustained fear I have ever felt. Worse than when Viveka had her appendix out at 14, and we nearly lost her. Worse than anything. In the end, I received a formal reprimand and a significant financial penalty, paid from the joint account which Walter signed off on without ever asking me why. We were never charged criminally. The lawyer negotiated it down. But my name was on the paperwork. My name was the one attached to the finding. Walter knew. He had to know. He watched it happen and he said nothing. He thanked me afterward in the way you thank someone for passing the salt, briefly, without quite meeting their eyes. I used to tell myself he was ashamed, that the shame was why he couldn't look at me directly for almost a year afterward. Later, I stopped being generous about it. We separated in 2013. Walter kept the business. I took the house and a settlement that was, in retrospect, far too small, but I was so exhausted by then that I would have signed almost anything to have it over. We didn't divorce immediately. For reasons I won't go into, it dragged on, but we separated, and I moved my life slowly into a smaller shape. The part that broke me wasn't the money or even the separation. It was Viveka. Walter never told her the truth. And Viveka, who knew only that her mother's name had appeared in a CRA finding related to her father's company, who had been raised to believe that her father was a self-made, honorable man, drew her own conclusions. She asked me, once, point blank, "Mom, did you steal from Dad's company?" I said no. But I couldn't explain without explaining everything, and explaining everything meant destroying the image she had of her father. And I couldn't do that to her. I still don't know if that was love or cowardice. Maybe both. She chose her father. Not dramatically, not cruelly. Viveka was never cruel by nature, but she drifted away from me with the quiet certainty of someone who has decided where they stand. Phone calls became monthly, then occasional. She stopped inviting me to things. When she got married, 3 years after the separation, I sat in the back of the church. My own daughter's wedding. Because she had asked me not to make it complicated, I wore a blue dress. I held my program in both hands so they wouldn't shake. Her father walked her down the aisle. I left before the reception because I didn't want to cry where anyone could see me. For the next several years, I built a life I had not planned for. I took a part-time job at a garden center. I'd always loved plants, and it turned out I was good at talking to people about them. I got a small apartment on the east side of Sudbury. I found a book club. I made friends who knew nothing about Walter or CRA investigations or any of it, and with them I could simply be Sylvie, who liked thrillers and made a reliable lemon tart. It wasn't the life I had imagined, but it was mine. Truly mine, maybe for the first time. Walter, meanwhile, had sold the business in 2016 for what I heard through mutual acquaintances was a substantial sum. He'd moved to a house outside Ottawa. He had a girlfriend for a few years, which bothered me less than I expected. He and Viveka remained close. He came to her kids' birthday parties. He was Grandpa Walter, reliable and present, and I was the grandmother who sent cards and was never quite sure if they were received. Then, in September of last year, Viveka called me. Not a text, an actual phone call, which startled me enough that I knocked over my tea answering it. "Dad has cancer," she said. "Pancreatic. Stage 4. I sat down on my kitchen stool. "How long?" They said maybe 6 months, could be less. There was a pause. I waited for her to say more. She didn't. "Viveka," I said. "I'm sorry. I know." A breath. "I just thought you should know." She hung up. I called her back 20 minutes later to ask if she needed anything, if she needed help with the kids while she was dealing with this, if there was anything practical I could do. She said she'd let me know. She didn't call again for 2 months. Walter died in March. I found out from my son-in-law. The funeral was held at a church in Cantata, where Walter had been living. I drove the 4 hours from Sudbury on a gray Friday morning. I wore black. I sat in the last pew on the left-hand side, near the door, and I looked at the casket at the front of the church and tried to find the right feeling. There wasn't one single right feeling. There was a whole tangle of them, grief and anger, and something that might have been relief, and something else I still don't have a name for. Viveka sat in the front row with her husband and their 2 children and her father's sister and a collection of people I had met once or twice over the years and mostly didn't recognize anymore. She looked like me, my daughter. She has always looked like me. I used to love that about her, when she was small. These days it catches me off guard. She didn't look back. After the service there was a reception at a nearby hall. I went, briefly. I spoke to Walter's sister, who has always been kind to me even when she didn't have to be. I had a cup of tea. A few people who didn't know the history said things like, "You must be so sad," and I said yes because it was easier. Viveka spoke to me once at the edge of the dessert table. She said, "There's a will reading next Thursday, at the lawyer's office in Kannada. You're mentioned." "Okay," I said. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Then she said, "Don't expect much, Mom. He told me a long time ago that he'd made sure things were taken care of." I understood what that meant, or I thought I did. I drove back to Sudbury that evening and I did not sleep well for the following week. Not because of the money. I want to be very clear about this. By that point, I had made peace, more or less, with the financial shape of my life. I had my pension, I had my small savings, I had the apartment I'd moved into after selling the house. I was not wealthy, but I was not in difficulty. What kept me awake was something else entirely. It was the question of what Walter had, in the end, decided to do about the truth. Because that was the thing I had never known. Whether he had, at any point in the years since the investigation, told Viveka what had actually happened. Whether she knew, really knew, that I had not stolen from her father's company, but had instead sacrificed my name to protect him. I parked outside the lawyer's office at 8:58 on Thursday morning. It was in a low brick building off Carling Avenue. The parking lot was half full. Viveka was already there when I walked in. She was standing with her husband near the window and they were talking quietly. She was dressed in dark gray. She had cut her hair since the funeral, shorter, more severe. It suited her. She looked up when I came in. Something flickered across her face. Not warmth, not hostility. Something more complicated than either. "Mom," she said. "Hi, sweetheart," I said, because I have never been able to call her anything else. Her husband nodded at me. He's always been cordial in a minimally functional way. There were 3 other people in the room. A cousin of Walter's I recognized, a business partner from the old company, and a woman I didn't know who turned out to be Walter's accountant. The lawyer was a tall man somewhere in his 50s, unhurried in the way that people who deal with grief professionally often become. He invited us to sit at the long table. He arranged papers in front of him. He put on reading glasses. Viveka sat across from me, slightly to my left. She had her hands folded on the table. She wasn't looking at me, but I could feel that she was aware of me. The lawyer began to read. Walter had left specific bequests to his sister, to the cousin, to a small number of charitable organizations. He had left his car and personal effects to Viveka. And then the lawyer paused, turned a page, and looked up briefly before continuing. He said, "To my daughter, Viveka, I leave the sum of $10,000 and my specific request that she read the enclosed letter." Viveka went very still. "And to my former wife, Sylvie," the lawyer continued in the same unhurried tone, "I leave the remainder of my estate, including the property at Pine Ridge Road in Kannada, the contents of the investment account held at TD Private Wealth, and any remaining liquid assets after the above bequests have been satisfied. The total approximate value of which, at the time of this writing, was $1.4 million. The room was quiet. Viveka turned and looked at me for the first time since I had walked through that door. Her face was, I don't have a single word for it. There was shock there, yes, but there was something else underneath it. Something that looked, almost, like she was beginning to understand something she hadn't allowed herself to understand before. "There is an accompanying letter," the lawyer said, "addressed to Viveka, to be opened now if she chooses." Viveka reached across the table with a hand that wasn't quite steady and took the envelope. I watched her open it. I watched her eyes move across the page. I watched her get to whatever part of it made her stop and press the back of her hand against her mouth. She sat like that for a moment. Then she looked up at me, and her eyes were full, and she said, in a voice that was not much more than a whisper, "Mom." He told me everything. I had prepared, I thought, for whatever was in that room. I had steeled myself against whatever came. But I had not prepared for the sound of my daughter saying those 4 words, and so I did not succeed in not crying after all. Walter's letter, which Viveka read to me later sitting in the car in that parking lot while her husband waited tactfully inside, was 4 pages long. Handwritten, his handwriting which I had known for 40 years, careful and slightly left-leaning. He explained what had happened in 2011, the full version. Not the version where I had been a culpable party, but the accurate version, in which he had mismanaged and obscured, and I had stepped forward when I didn't have to. He explained why he hadn't said anything at the time. He used the word cowardice, and he used it about himself, without flinching, which was more than I had ever heard from him in person. He said he had been too afraid of Viveka's opinion of him, of losing the position he'd spent his whole life building, to correct the record. He said he had lived with it for 11 years, that he had not done it well, that the money was not an apology, because no amount of money constituted an apology, but that it was the only concrete thing he could still do. He asked Viveka to understand that her mother was not who she had believed her to be, and to consider whether the relationship she'd let go of was one she might want back. The last line of the letter was, "I should have said this while I was still there to say it. That is my failure, not hers." We sat in that parking lot for a long time. Viveka is not by nature a demonstrative person. She gets that from me, actually. She was quiet for a long time after we finished the letter, looking out through the windshield at the gray March sky. I didn't push her. I have learned over 67 years that some things cannot be pushed. Finally, she said, "I owe you an apology. I owe you a very big apology." I said, "You didn't know. I didn't want to know," she said. "That's different." I didn't argue. She wasn't wrong. She reached over and took my hand, the way she used to when she was small and we were crossing a street. We sat like that for a while. Neither of us said anything. Eventually, she said, "The kids want to know why they've never had a proper relationship with their grandmother." "What did you tell them?" "I told them it was complicated." She paused. "I'd like to give them a better answer." I said that I would like that too. I drove back to Sudbury that afternoon. The highway was clear. The sky the particular pale blue that comes in March when winter is loosening its grip but hasn't let go yet. I thought about Walter, about the 23-year-old woman I had been, and the man holding paint rollers, and all the years between that moment and this one. I thought about all the things that get decided without us knowing they're being decided, all the ways one choice fans out into years. I don't know what to feel about him, even now. I suspect I won't sort it out cleanly. Grief rarely permits that kind of tidiness. But I know this. I have my daughter back. Tentatively, carefully, like a plant that has been repotted and needs time to establish. But back. She called me last week. A regular call, not with news attached to it, just to talk. We spoke for an hour about nothing important, and it was, without question, one of the best hours I have had in years. The money is in trust while the estate finalizes. I've spoken to a financial advisor, a woman I found through my doctor's recommendation, about what to do with it. I have not made any decisions yet. It does not feel like a windfall. It feels more like a debt being settled, years late, in the only currency he had left. My roses need pruning again. It's that time of year. I went out this morning with my shears and I worked my way along the bed, cutting back the dead growth, looking for the green underneath. There's always green underneath if you cut back far enough. That's the thing about roses. They look finished and then they aren't. I stood there in the thin spring sunlight and I thought, I have today. And tomorrow, probably. And if I'm lucky, a good many more days after that. Days with my daughter in them and her children, and whatever I decide to build next with the years I have left. It was enough. More than enough. It was finally mine.